The manufacturing industry has brought China a rapid economic rise no other country has ever experienced before. Many were lifted out of poverty, and all this growth gave birth to a middle class. So a higher standard of living means that a country can't be competitive cost-wise when it comes to manufacturing labor-intensive products.
Chinese companies go out into Africa. Now, why? At this time, something else was happening. Globalization is actually taking off. But in globalization, labor lost and capital won. And so when capital won, what happened was in places where capital was cheap but labor was high, like here, capital then began to invest in places where labor was cheap. Initially, it wasn't directly in China. Anyone who remembers what happens in the 90s, it was the maquiladoras in Mexico along the border with the US-Mexico border when these huge factories were moving over there. But eventually, as trade became more widespread and travel became easier, then global value chains began to develop, and China was in the middle of global value chains. China became like the factory of the world. And what do you need in a factory? You need resources to be able to convert that to finished products. Where did you have resources? Africa had the largest endowment of natural resources, so it made sense that China would go to Africa seeking resources.
The Chinese said, well, guess what? We are the best in the world now at producing large-scale infrastructure fast and cheap. And we have a surplus of capital. So we'll loan you the money. We have our great contracting companies. We have all of this skill and all this ability to deliver fast and cheap. And in that sense, it was really an ideal match.
Therefore, Chinese companies are setting up their own operations in Africa, the cheapest and lowest skilled labor markets in the world. This move was further accelerated after the beginning of the America-China trade war. Today, China is now the largest trading partner with Africa as a whole. The debt trap narrative is right to identify an inherent power differential between giant China and the mostly much smaller countries it lends to.
We needed investors to come and invest, and the people to knock on the door first were the Chinese. The Chinese are the major employers. You know, if there was no China in Chinese investors in Zambia, the construction industry was going to shrink by half.
I think let's look at the figures. Today, only 30% of Zambia's foreign debt is held by China. 70% is held by Western countries and private individuals, well, private organizations. Most of the private debt today is between the USA and Britain in terms of private market bonds. If there's a debt trap, really, it's the USA and Britain that are holding Zambia at ransom in terms of debt. China only holds 30%. And what has that 30% debt been spent on? It has spent on developing hydropower stations, airports, roads, water systems, hospitals, schools, government buildings, and so on. What does the 70% that we hold from the Western countries, mainly USA and Britain, what do we have to show for it? Speculative, profiteering debt.
However, China is not trying to create debt traps because they are cultivating new consumers to buy products from Chinese companies in the future. Therefore, by portraying China as the only bad actor with urgency without backing it with data, immunizes corrupt African politicians of all culpability. Take a look, for instance, at the amount of debt China has refinanced, renegotiated, or outright forgiven.
The corruption is in public domain. I'm not saying anything secret. It is not the Chinese or English or problem. Our laws are very good. Now, the issue is that our own political people are the ones who are, bastardizing these laws.
As well, are they comparing apples to oranges? Because if you're comparing commercial loans to something available from the World Bank or one of its different agencies, then you're not really comparing like for like. And the fact of the matter is this, and I hope the borrowers out there are listening, 95%, if not 99%, of the loan agreement are there in favor of the lenders, no matter who you deal with. This is because by the time you sign that loan agreement and you get the money, you'll have the money in your hands, and the only thing the bank will have is a piece of paper. That is why the loan agreements are in their favor.
By the first quarter of 2009, China had canceled 150 such loans owed by 32 African countries.
We can just see that during COVID-19, China actually, rather than double down on the commitments that African nations had to China in relation to these projects, actually went into debt relief arrangements and allowed for either a total pause on all loan payments or for a renegotiation of these loan payments. And that occurred with over 19 African countries during the pandemic. And so there really is no truth to these accusations. The thing is that one of the interesting underlying myths that is spread is that it's all about the Chinese government, right?
In 2018, Chinese president announced forgiveness of all intergovernmental zero-interest loans for least developed African countries with diplomatic relations with China. This suggests recipients have some degree of leverage. It is up to African nations to decide how they want to manage their own internal affairs and with which countries they want to engage with. Whether it comes to trade relations, investments, diplomatic relations, or cultural exchanges, it is really up to each African nation to decide how it wants to manage its business. Most of us misunderstand why China invests in Africa, whether it's loans or infrastructure. Everyone on social media thinks it's for resources or political influence, but it's neither. It is for African countries to go from resource exporter to goods purchaser. If you study their current economic and development model, China is keen on maintaining their status quo in manufacturing, maintaining a small percentage of cheap goods, and also middle-level to high-end goods such as electric vehicles and electronics.
Its own productive capacity, China is not resource-rich in totality. It needs things like gas. It needs things like copper. It needs these resources in order to be this huge industrial country that it is, while Africa also needs the capacity to industrialize. And that's what China is helping Africa to achieve. All 53 countries have very close relationships to the point where since 2009, China has been Africa's largest trading partner.
These brands are already competing with the Western brands. That's why there was sanctions on Chinese firms during Trump's presidency. China foresees more political conflict with the US, so they cannot solely depend on the US being its customer. What they are doing is loaning money to these poor countries to build up their infrastructure and helping their citizens become wealthier. Then in return, they will buy Chinese-made goods. Whether they are politically aligned with China or not, China needs 1.2 billion of new market, while Africa needs the money to purchase. China gets the market, and on top of that, an interest from the loan, then Africa gets the loans to have a better life.
The establishment of the China-Egypt TDAC Cooperation Zone has so far created more than 3,000 job opportunities for local people. As the business expands, this number will rise to 40,000. It has also contributed nearly $60 million to local tax revenues. The project has now become an important platform for China-Egypt capacity cooperation.
The real concern here is greedy leaders and shady loans deals which are often squandered, leaving Africans with tax burdens. Politicians and high-ranking officials like these kinds of projects because they get a commission of 10%. That's how they get rich. The bigger the debt, the more they get paid.
Well, I think that in developing countries, there is corruption, just like in developed countries. In the USA, it's called lobbying, and here it's called corrupted due to change the law.
China is like that friendly credit card company that will always be there.
I think there is an assumption that certain governments are not able to look after themselves, or they're either not sophisticated enough, or just simply too corrupt to look after its own interests.
The outcomes in China have been remarkable. The fact that they lifted almost 300 million people out of extreme poverty in such a short amount of time is amazing. The Chinese are focused on getting initiatives completed, and they are doing it very quickly. They know that a growing economy needs a healthy population of consumers. They know countries like US, UK, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and France will be threatened by a growing Chinese economy, and so they cannot depend on those consumers to continuously buy products from Chinese companies. That's why they are trying to cultivate new consumers to buy products from Chinese companies in the future, by projecting soft diplomacy with investments to create a positive mindset towards China and Chinese products.